Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler. Got a picture of the human story I'm trying to convey. It's really been pretty central to the whole trip I've been on since 1970 that some things that we haven't recognized as being inevitable have been, in fact, inevitable in the human story. And there are important ramifications to that I've been stressing. And for me, back at the beginning of that idea, back there, the parable of the tribes, the problem of power in social evolution, back in 1970, and that gets published in 1984 from the University of California Press. The essential thing was that there are inevitable consequences, somewhat dire consequences, inevitable, if a creature steps onto the path of civilization, if it extricates itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life, that step inevitably unleashes a destructive force, a social evolutionary force where what it evolves as that creature's civilization is inevitably going to be a tormented process, because the systemic nature of what's changed from being in one's niche to being out of it turns out to generate a systemic dynamic, a process of selection that takes things in a direction that people wouldn't have chosen, but at that point couldn't avoid, as if you'd stepped off the edge of a cliff. There's no stopping it once it gets started. And I focused on that essentially central point of discontinuity in the history of life on Earth, up until the point where the hunter-gatherers that were our ancestors begin to change the way that they live and the structure and size and subsistence of their societies, that all of biological evolution had worked in a certain way. But here you have a new kind of life form that's not biologically evolved. It comes out of the creative imagination of the creature, and all of a sudden you unleash a destructive force. I won't go into why that is inevitable, except to say I lay it out in a variety of ways on my website at betterhumanstory.org. But I've been focused for decades on the consequences of that point of discontinuity. In other words, when you get a creature that steps onto the path of civilization by inventing its own way of life, at that point, a whole bunch of things become inevitable. And that book back there, talks about some of them, but it only took it so far. And I've had, since 1984, plenty of time to find out what some of the other inevitabilities are, which I'll just name without, as with the other one. I'm not trying to prove it right now. One thing that's inevitable, the inevitable emergence of what you might call a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world more broken, or make the human world worse. That's an inevitable thing. I think it can also be shown in the same evolutionary perspective that countering that inevitably destructive thing, there are forces that emerge along with the evolution of a creature like Homo sapiens. There emerge some forces that are basically life-serving, that got selected for in the biological process, and got selected for meaning that they helped people make the right choices to continue and get their DNA into the future. That's how evolution works. And it's there that we find that there is this other force that is similarly can be shown to be coherent, that consistently works to make the human world better, or more whole versus more broken. And you can say that at the center, inevitably at the center of that creature's world. There will be a battle between these two forces, one working in the direction of greater wholeness, one working in the direction of greater brokenness. And the part of what you will find on A Better Human Story is that the visibility and the reality of there being such coherent forces is well shown, I think, on that site, particularly the force of brokenness, because whatever it is about me, I've been much more focused on the force of brokenness, this coherent thing that's consistently making the human world more broken. That's been part of the human world since it began, and leads to the understanding that because of these inevitabilities, human history was darker than our inborn nature required. And I have as one of the things I believe can be shown to be, as far as I can see, inescapably valid, is that the ugliness that we see in human history is not human nature writ large. The inevitability of a selection for the ways of power mean that any creature anywhere that steps onto the path of civilization will be condemned to these inevitabilities, which might be summed up as saying that the spirit of the gangster, we see some of them in the world stage these days, and it's well represented in the pages of history. The spirit of the gangster will inevitably be given a disproportionate say in how that civilization develops. That's pretty strong stuff to recognize that we really haven't been in control of how civilization has evolved. Or rather, we control some things, but there's been a fundamental dynamic that's been going on having to do with this inevitable selection for the ways of power that have driven things in uglier ways than we would choose if we got a chance to really make a choice. But once we extricated ourselves from the natural order and plunged the human world into a disorder called anarchy, certain things became inevitable. So there are a couple other inevitabilities that I've been studying for the past whatever number of years, but it's inevitable that human beings will become broken by the nature of this social evolutionary process, and that brokenness begets brokenness, and you can see the coherent ways in which this destructive force can be seen. And the phrase I like to use is, we can see this force the way we can see the wind in the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. We don't actually see the wind. You don't actually see the force, but you can see the impact of it as its brokenness begets brokenness. And then you come to the point where you see that one of the inevitabilities, actually, since the breakthrough into civilization is necessarily going to be done by a cultural animal. And culture means the ability to do two things. One is to innovate things that aren't laid down in the DNA, but are the products of the inventive species. And then also to pass along in that creature's culture, and that's what culture is the patterns and knowledge and whatever else you want to call it, that gets passed from generation to generation. To be a cultural animal means that you are able to pass new things on to subsequent generations. And that implies a kind of cumulativeness. Not that the civilizations or cultures can't deteriorate here or there, but basically there is you pile things on, and when stone weapons give way to bronze weapons, which give way to iron weapons, and on to steel, and onto an arms race like we lived through, you can see that there's an inevitability that the culture becomes more and more powerful. Ups and downs, yes, but more powerful. And if something's going to get, can keep getting more powerful as it accumulates better and better innovations for the whatever purposes, it gets more and more powerful with its weapons, with its impact on the planet's living systems. It will inevitably get eventually, if it takes a finite amount of power to be able to destroy yourself, but you'll eventually get to whatever that level is, it being finite, if you're continually increasing over time, so that the power of modern industrial military compared to the power of the great Roman Empire with all its legions, there's hardly any comparison. And then we've entered the nuclear age, and we've got the power to destroy ourselves. And I think it is inevitable that any creature that breaks through in this way will not only get swept up in the selection for power and the dominance of the spirit of the gangster, but it'll also inevitably get the power to destroy itself. And so it will inevitably face the challenge. Will it be able to bring this force of brokenness under control and create an order for its civilization that will allow it to endure for the long haul? And will it be able to do that well enough and soon enough that it doesn't destroy itself? And I'll add parenthetically that with the case of human civilization on this planet, it's really unclear that we're going to get it together in time to prevent our self-destruction. But it is inevitable that on any planet that civilization might arise with any other species. And by the way, if you look at the number of planets that they're talking about, well, I'll get back to that in a minute when I talk about the other inevitabilities on the earlier side of that point of discontinuity. But eventually, when you get to that point of discontinuity, I'll just stop with that and say, eventually the creature is going to have to bring destructiveness under control, or it will destroy itself. All that's inevitable. And go to a better human story, and you'll see my efforts to make those conclusions irresistible. But lately, I've been kind of excited because I've seen that the picture of inevitabilities, or at least near inevitabilities, some of these things aren't real easy for me to judge, and I haven't spent a half century looking at the inevitabilities I originally claimed in that book. But the number of planets is something like some number in 77 zeros or sextillion. I mean, it is so huge, it just boggles the mind, because there are billions of galaxies. I mean, this is, I just don't know what to do with this kind of information, but there are billions of galaxies, there are billions of stars in the galaxies, and a fairly high percentage of them have planets. I mean, nobody's spotted anything that looks, like, oh, it's just like Earth. But we've only seen such a small proportion of the billion, trillion planets that are now believed to exist in the cosmos. So, in view of that, I think that another inevitability that starts the ball rolling is that it is inevitable that there will be a lot of planets in which life begins. And you look at, what does life require? What does it require to say life has begun on this planet? It's got to do with self-replication, and people talk about it needs. We've only got carbon-based life here. We only have DNA here, and it requires certain things we think having to do with water and the magnetic field and a whole lot of Goldilocks things that are just right. Maybe I'm underestimating just, how extraordinarily Goldilocks the Earth is. But with that number of planets that there are, I think like multiple, well, just more than the sands in the seas. I just don't imagine that our planet is so much the only one that it's the only place that it could happen. I'm imagining that out of all them, there are going to be quite a few where life begins. In fact, I'm going to call it inevitable, but that's just my seat of the pants thing. And then, if life begins, what's inevitable then? Well, the selection for whatever these self-replicating things are that can survive gets combined with the fact that self-replicating things don't always replicate themselves into exact copies of what they are. There are going to be mutations. Apparently, there are also exchanges once you got. Anyway, the mutations lead to a kind of branching out. Whatever can work to get its DNA into the future, among all the varieties that ever arise, gets to go into the future and be part of the systems of life on that planet. So there'll be a branching, inevitably, of whatever life emerges, carbon-based or otherwise. It's not going to just be one thing forever. It's going to be many things, and it's a wholly opportunistic process. Apparently, one doesn't see a divine hand working on it, I don't think, but you do see enormous amount of creativity taking place just naturally by the nature of things. That what can survive tends to be better ordered than the things that can't survive, and that involves also the relationships among the elements. That you can't get your DNA into the future if you destroy your environment. Gregory Bateson said famously, no creature can win against its environment for long. So you got relationships being selected for by a purely opportunistic process. Apparently, I mean, that's what the evolutionary perspective seems to show. And as it branches out, there will be a whole lot of branches that take different strategies for their survival. You get a division between, well, different kinds of bacteria. You get a division of different kinds of archaea, whatever they are. You get a division between plants and animals. You get speciation along them, and you get some exchange that's horizontal in some of these kingdoms. But in any event, there will be all kinds of strategies, inevitably, for survival. So that's another step that we take as we start at the beginning of time, and we get to the point where eventually we're going to get to that point of discontinuity where some creature steps across the threshold into the civilizing process and unleashes these other inevitabilities, which we talked about before. So we've got all kinds of strategies, and one of those strategies, I think it's appropriate to say, will inevitably involve the use of intelligence. I mean, we've got an intelligent invertebrate in octopuses, octopi, whatever it is. There's a lot of parallel development which shows that you can get into a situation where greater intelligence is being selected for as strategy for survival, and then among all those who have a strategy for survival, there will be continual selective process that will go on, where some of these intelligence-using creatures get into a pattern where more and more intelligence is getting rewarded by the selective process. So if you look at Lucy from whatever it is, 3.8 or 4 million years ago, she had a brain, about a third the size of a modern human being. The whole business about the development of the human brain is a big field, but in any event, you can see that if you look at our ancestors and some of the hominids that didn't lead directly to us as well, there was a growth of the brain, which is not surprising because, well, that's the strategy the creature has adopted, and so you can get to there being two branches of the Homo line, where the Homo sapiens is one branch that has culture. But then we can find that though we departed from branching, Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals also had culture. So I believe we've separated from them something like 700,000 years ago. Um, and I think culture played some role. But there's being a selection for culture, sort of affirmed by the fact that it was inevitable that given the path that we were on, we were going to get more and more invested in culture. Bigger brains, more dimensions to our culture. Domestication of fire, painting on walls. Who knows what all they had in the way of these are cultural animals. And it was increasing. And over the hundreds of thousands of years, it appears that as inevitably would be the case, the feedback loops were such that the people who are best at culture became more of what got into the future with their DNA, so that brains grew, hands became better adapted to tool use over time. These aren't all the same time scale, I don't think. Also, speech. I mean, every human group that we ever see on this planet has a language. Must be a beginning to that, and maybe we can infer it from seeing how the apparatus of speech evolved as the people who were better able to make use of this cultural strategy with tools and with language and with whatever else was useful culturally. The ability to learn what your culture is trying to teach you. All those things sort of grow, and culture becomes more and more central. And by the time you get, I mean, I'm not sure what the evidence suggests about how much culture changed from 50,000 years ago to the beginnings of gardening and herding as people broke out of the niche in which they evolved biologically. But eventually, I think I can say, it would be inevitable that as culture gets bigger and bigger and more and stronger, and the investment in that approach grows and grows, and the organism itself gets shaped more and more for using it, eventually there will be culture breaking out of the niche in which the creature evolved biologically. In the case of our species, by the way, we're evidently, most of us anyway, 2% Neanderthal, so they didn't entirely die out. They're here with us. The evolution of a culture will eventually get to the point where, like some hunter-gatherers, for reasons we can go into is another thing, but they start to grow the crops they used to, as hunter-gatherers, gather, and to herd the animals they used to, as hunters, hunt. And this is a pattern of life that is new. And it's not part of the natural order in the same way as everything else that evolved, that is, adapted to disruptions from outside the living order, like asteroids and ice ages and stuff like that. But basically, it's been a kind of a unitary, synergistic, and therefore viable thing that's emerged. But as soon as something emerges that's sort of like a new life form that didn't go through that kind of vetting process, food production, taking control of the natural world rather than living off of what it inevitably will lead to a kind of a disorder. And here we are, back to that first point of discontinuity. So I think that the human story maybe, well, I don't know whether it's going to end with our destroying ourselves or our getting our act together. But I think that I can say with probably more confidence than I should that on a lot of planets, life has emerged. It's inevitable. There are a lot of them, I'm saying. And a lot of those planets, there will emerge creatures that have taken in the branching process the route of using intelligence to as a major part of its adaptation. And once you get invested in intelligence, it's eventually, inevitably, there will be some creature that starts using that intelligence to create things that are discontinuous with the niche that that are more and more the life will be shaped by culture. And eventually, as that continues to develop in its cumulative way, selection within the organism and accumulation within the culture, to a breakout where the creature starts taking more control over its environment. And unwittingly leaves a well-regulated order and plunges into a disorder that has social evolutionary consequences that couldn't have been foreseen, it couldn't have been avoided, and that we're still coping with now. So from the number of planets to the nature of the challenge that we face about whether we can order our civilization well enough and soon enough, that we can survive for the long haul on this planet rather than destroy ourselves. From the number of planets to the challenge of getting your civilization together so you don't destroy yourself, at every step, it looks kind of inevitable to me. So that's why I say that mankind's story, humankind's story, biological evolution, culture, breakthrough into civilization, the unleashing of a destructive force, the race to bring that destructive force under control in time. All of that, I think, is so inevitable that it must have taken place all over the cosmos. There, out of the trillion, billion planets there must have been a bunch of places where all that step by step happened. And how it turned out for them really interests me. And I write about that. If you go to a betterhumanstory.org and you search in the search box for the fate of civilization, I have an essay there where I imagine a cosmic historian or social scientist that looks at all these planets that have faced this challenge inevitably and speculates about what differentiates those that got their act together and survived from those that destroyed itself. So if you go to a betterhumanstory.org and you search for the fate of civilization, it's an article that's on my website and it's also on Three Quarks Daily. You'll see that there are some clarifications of the challenge that we face that are found in that essay. And my guess is, since I think our situation is a toss-up whether we're going to make it or not, I'm just going to guess there'll be about as many that destroy themselves as it got it together. That it's a toss-up. that our species is typical, and it's hard to tell where we're going to be in two centuries or so. Whether we'll be a smoldering post-nuclear Holocaust planet where life itself is struggling, will we have gotten ourselves organized well enough to create a civilization that can survive for the long haul? Will we have brought ourselves under sufficient control because we have been an ever greater bull in the china shop with this biosphere we live in and depend on? Will we get that together to be able to organize our impact on the planet so that it can go on? I mean, that we don't bring on ourselves the kind of disaster that this climate disruption looks like it well might be. So, inevitabilities. I'm still trying to work through how to see it and see what the ramifications are. To not only at the point of discontinuity do we find inevitable things happening, but all the steps leading up to it. I find that exciting, and I'm not sure what the implications of it are besides what I was just able to articulate. Thank you. Please go to abetterhumanstory.org and please follow these videos in which I'm struggling to present something that I think clarifies a lot about what our situation is. Thanks.